In the quiet village of Nyangoma, nestled between the dry hills and whispering acacia trees, lived a young woman named Zawadi. She wasn't rich. In fact, her life was filled with daily struggles, fetching water from faraway wells, working long hours in the fields under the harsh sun, and stretching a single meal to feed both herself and her aging aunt. Yet, what made her different was her heart. Zawadi had the kind of soul that glowed even when the world seemed dark. She gave without hesitation, whether it was sharing her last piece of bread with a hungry child or offering her only shawl to a shivering neighbor on a cold night. The people in the village often shook their heads and whispered that she was too soft, that she would never survive with such a big heart in such a hard world. But Zawadi didn't care. She believed that kindness was stronger than fear, and that helping others, even when you have little, is what truly made life meaningful. Children would follow her around, giggling and calling her Mama Moyo, Mother of Hearts, because she always had a smile, a story, or a snack tucked away in her basket. Though she had no gold or land, Zawadi was rich in spirit. Her laughter made others laugh. Her compassion made even the grumpiest elder soften. And while others counted cattle or coins, Zawadi counted blessings. She was the thread that held her village together, quietly, gently, with nothing but love. No one could have guessed that one small act of kindness she would soon offer, a simple plate of food to a stranger, would come back years later to change her life in the most unimaginable way. The skies above Nyangoma turned cruel. Day after day, the sun burned hotter, and the rains that once brought life stopped coming. Cracks spread across the earth like broken promises, and the rivers dried up to dust. Crops withered before they could grow, and the once green fields turned brown and lifeless. Goats grew thin, chickens stopped laying eggs, and water became a treasure people would fight over. In the village, whispers turned into arguments. People began to look at each other with suspicion, wondering who had food, who was hiding water, who would survive and who wouldn't. Zawadi felt the change like a weight pressing on her chest. Her small garden had nothing left but dry leaves and dead stems. Her aunt, old and frail, needed food and water, but there was hardly enough to go around. Even the laughter of children faded. They were too hungry to play. The market was silent. The pots in homes sat empty. The scent of cooking fires that once filled the air was gone, replaced by the smell of dust and despair. Neighbors began to close their doors to each other. Fear does that. It makes people forget how to love. But not Zawadi. Even as her own stomach growled, she shared what little she had. A spoon of millet here, a cup of water there. She could feel the eyes watching her, judging her. "You'll starve too," some muttered. But she didn't stop. The drought had taken so much already. Zawadi refused to let it take her humanity. And deep inside, though no one could see it, something powerful was growing in that dry season. A seed of destiny, because soon someone would come to her door. Someone starving, broken, forgotten. And Zawadi's next choice would change everything. One scorching afternoon, when the wind carried nothing but dust and silence, a shadow appeared on the narrow path leading into Nyangoma. It was a man, tired, sunburned, barely standing. His clothes were torn, his feet cracked from walking barefoot, and his face was covered in sweat and pain. He stumbled forward, eyes searching for mercy, and then collapsed right at the edge of Zawadi's home, falling into the dry dirt like a broken branch. The villagers saw him, but none moved closer. In times like these, fear ruled everything. "Who is he?" they whispered from their doorways. "A thief? A cursed soul? What if he carries sickness?" They shook their heads and turned away. In a world with no food, no one wanted to share. In a world full of fear, kindness felt dangerous. Children were pulled indoors. Women clutched their thin bags of grain tighter. No one wanted to get involved. But Zawadi didn't look away. Her heart pulled her forward, even though her legs hesitated. She saw not just a stranger, but a human being, hungry, helpless, and forgotten. As the villagers watched from a distance, whispering and frowning, she knelt beside the man. His lips were dry, his breath shallow, his body shaking. Zawadi touched his forehead. It burned with fever. He didn't even have the strength to speak. Despite everything, despite the drought, the fear, the warnings, Zawadi did something no one else dared to do. She reached into her small clay pot and brought out the little food she had saved. Carefully, gently, she lifted his head and gave him water. The villagers gasped, but Zawadi didn't stop. She saw pain, and where others turned away, she chose compassion. That moment would not only save the man, it would plant the first spark of a miracle. Zawadi sat beside the stranger as he lay barely breathing, his lips cracked and eyes half closed from exhaustion and hunger. She knew what it meant to go hungry. Her own stomach had been aching for days, but something inside her refused to walk away. As the village watched from behind curtains and fences, Zawadi reached for the small woven cloth beside her, unwrapping the only meal she had left. It wasn't much, just a handful of ugali and a few beans she had saved for her aunt and herself. But in that moment, looking at the broken man on the ground, Zawadi didn't see a burden. She saw someone who needed her. She gently lifted his head and placed a piece of the food to his lips. At first, he didn't respond, too weak even to chew, so she dipped her fingers in water and slowly helped him swallow small bites, bit by bit. Around her, whispers grew louder. "She's lost her mind," someone murmured. "Feeding a stranger while her own family starves," another hissed. But Zawadi didn't stop. She wasn't doing it for praise or pride. She was doing it because it was right. Her aunt called out from inside the house, begging her to think again. But Zawadi simply replied, "If we close our hearts now, what kind of people will we become?" The villagers shook their heads and walked away, convinced she had made a foolish choice. But Zawadi stayed. She gave the man water, covered him with a cloth, and sat beside him until he finally slept, his breathing steady at last. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his story, but she knew this. When the world turns cold, someone has to stay warm, and that someone, in Nyangoma, was always Zawadi. As the sun dipped low behind the hills and the sky turned orange, the stranger slowly opened his eyes. His strength was still weak, but the food and water Zawadi had given him brought life back into his body. He looked around, confused at first, then his eyes rested on Zawadi sitting quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap. For a moment he didn't speak. He just stared at her, as if trying to understand why someone would show him such kindness when the world had shown him none. With trembling hands, he reached out and touched her arm. His voice was dry and cracked, but his words were clear. You saved me," he whispered. Zawadi smiled gently and shook her head. "You were hungry. I did what anyone should do." But the man knew better. He had seen the fear in the eyes of others. He had heard the doors slam, had felt the sting of rejection, and yet here she was, this young woman who had given him her last meal, her time and her warmth, asking for nothing in return. Tears welled up in his eyes, thick and slow, carving clean paths down his dusty face. "I don't have anything to give you," he said. "Not today, but I swear on my life, one day I will return, and I will repay you." Zawadi looked at him, surprised by the weight in his words. But she nodded kindly. She didn't expect anything. She never did. For her, kindness was not a transaction. Still, something in his voice, something deep and steady, made her heart pause. He meant it. The moment passed quietly, but it left behind a promise that would one day come back, not with words, but with something far greater. The weeks passed, but the rains still didn't come. Life in Nyangoma became even harder. What little food remained in the village was guarded tightly, and people became colder. Zawadi's small home looked more empty by the day. Her aunt grew weaker, and Zawadi often skipped meals, just so the old woman could eat. Every time someone passed by and saw her, they shook their heads and whispered cruel things. "That girl gave her last food to a stranger," they'd say, laughing. "Now look at her, hungry and foolish." At the well, women moved away from her when she approached. Children pointed and giggled. Even her friends stopped visiting, afraid to be seen with the girl everyone now called the one who gave everything for nothing. Zawadi heard it all, the gossip, the judgment, the mocking laughter. It stung, but she never fought back. She just kept moving, one step at a time, helping her aunt, sweeping her dusty floor, and hoping, somehow, that better days would come. There were nights she cried in silence, not because she regretted her choice, but because she was tired, tired of being alone, tired of being hungry, tired of being treated like she was crazy. Still, in her heart, she held on to something small and quiet, a memory of the man she had helped, the tears in his eyes, and the promise he had made. Most people would have forgotten a stranger by now, but not Zawadi. She believed in kindness, even when the world didn't, and while others saw her as poor and pitiful, what they didn't see was that her heart was rich, rich with something they had long buried, compassion. What no one knew was that this same heart, so full of love, was about to be rewarded in a way no one could imagine. The dusty silence of Nyangoma was suddenly broken one afternoon by a deep, rumbling sound. Children stopped playing. Elders paused mid-conversation. Farmers looked up from their fields. From beyond the hills, a line of shiny black vehicles slowly appeared, rolling down the rough village road like something out of a dream. No one had ever seen anything like it. They weren't trucks or buses. They were luxury cars, each one sleeker and more polished than the last. Their windows tinted, their tires stirring up clouds of red dust as they moved. People rushed out of their homes, barefoot and breathless, mouths hanging open. "Who are they?" someone gasped. "Is it the government? Celebrities?" Others whispered. The cars didn't stop at the chief's compound or the marketplace. Instead, they rolled through the heart of the village and came to a slow, quiet stop right in front of Zawadi's small, crumbling home. A hush fell over the crowd. Eyes widened. Children clutched their mothers. No one could understand what was happening. Zawadi, dressed in her faded skirt and torn sandals, stepped out of her hut, shielding her eyes from the sun. She blinked at the sight before her. Shiny doors opening, well-dressed men and women stepping out, their shoes gleaming, their faces calm but serious. The villagers watched in stunned silence. Some whispered her name, others just stared. Zawadi stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had never seen such cars in her life, let alone parked at her doorstep. What did they want with her? Was this a mistake? But deep inside, past the confusion and fear, something stirred, a memory, a promise, and slowly, without even realizing it, her hands began to tremble, because somehow she already knew. From one of the sleek black cars, a tall man stepped out. He wore a crisp white shirt, neatly pressed trousers, and polished shoes that barely picked up the dust of the village ground. His posture was strong, his face calm, but his eyes were searching for something or someone. At first, no one recognized him. He looked nothing like the ragged, weak man who had once collapsed in front of Zawadi's house. His beard was neatly trimmed, his skin glowing with health, and around his wrist was a watch that looked more expensive than anything the villagers had ever seen. He stood still for a moment, then slowly turned toward Zawadi. Their eyes met, and in that quiet second, the memory came rushing back. Her eyes widened, his lips curled into a soft, grateful smile. "It's you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Yes," he replied gently, stepping closer. "It's me." Mosi gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. People looked at one another, stunned and confused. The same man they had chased away? The same one they had mocked her for helping? This was him? Mosi walked up to Zawadi, now trembling from head to toe. He bowed his head slightly and said, "I told you I'd come back, and I meant it." He turned to face the villagers, his voice now stronger, clear and calm. "Years ago, I was starving. No one helped me, except her. She gave me food, hope, and dignity when I had nothing. The people who once mocked her now stood in complete silence, their eyes full of shock and regret. Mosi turned back to Zawadi and smiled. "Today, I didn't come to take. I came to give. And in that moment, her entire life began to change. With the entire village watching in stunned silence, Mosi gently took Zawadi's hand and led her toward one of the luxury cars. A few seconds later, a large white cloth covering something nearby was pulled away, revealing a stunning new house. It stood proudly where her broken hut once leaned, shining under the sun, with fresh paint, strong walls, glass windows, and a small garden already blooming with flowers. Gasps filled the air. Zawadi's hand flew to her mouth. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her name was carved beautifully on the wooden sign at the entrance. Zawadi's Haven. But Mosi wasn't done. He turned to the crowd again. This woman didn't know who I was. She had nothing, but she gave me everything. Because of her, I survived. I left this village with nothing but her kindness in my heart, and that kindness became the seed that changed my life. He pointed across the field, where workers were now raising signs and preparing an open plot. Here, he said, will be the Zawadi Academy, a school for children in this village, so they never have to go hungry or hopeless like I once did. The villagers clapped slowly at first, then louder, then all at once. Some wept, some hung their heads in shame, and Zawadi, still frozen in place, had tears pouring down her face. I was just a stranger, Mosi continued, but her kindness gave me strength. I worked, I learned, I built. Today I run companies across 3 countries, but none of that would have happened without her. Zawadi looked at him with disbelief. She had been mocked for giving away 1 meal, but now that one act of kindness had come back, multiplied beyond anything she could have ever imagined. As the celebration continued and the sun began to set over the village, a new kind of silence settled, one filled with reflection, not judgment. The same people who had once mocked Zawadi now looked at her with eyes full of respect. Mothers who had once pulled their children away from her now held those children tighter, whispering, "Learn from her." Elders who had shaken their heads at her foolish heart now nodded slowly, as if finally understanding the lesson they had missed for years. Zawadi stood quietly beside Mosi, her eyes still watery, her hands trembling slightly, but there was peace on her face, not pride, not anger, just calm. She had never helped Mosi for praise. She hadn't expected anything in return. Her heart had been moved by compassion, and that was enough for her. But now, that same compassion had become her legacy. The chief of the village stepped forward, bowed his head, and said, "We were wrong, Zawadi. You saw value where we saw burden. You gave when we were too afraid to lose. And today, we see what you truly are, a blessing among us." Children gathered near her, touching her hands, smiling up at her like she was a queen. Teenagers whispered her name like a hero. Even the gossiping neighbors lowered their heads, ashamed but grateful. Mosi looked at the people and said, "Kindness never dies. It lives, it travels, and one day, it returns. I am proof of that." From that day on, the story of Zawadi was told in every home, every school, every evening gathering, not just as a tale of riches and return, but as a reminder that true worth is not in gold or fame, but in a kind heart, even when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. Remember, kindness has the power to change lives. Never underestimate the impact of a simple good deed.